Good morning, students. This lecture is for March the 31st. Hope all of you are well and safe. We were talking about Shinto, and we had gotten to the point of more modern Shinto, the late 19th century. And when the Constitution of 1889 came into effect, the state literally took over all of the over 100,000 Shinto shrines throughout the country. And as a result of this, each shrine by the state was dedicated to some local deity, some hero, some event. And the Grand Imperial Shrine was dedicated to, of course, the mother goddess of Japan, Amaterasu. The typical shrine, and we're talking about state Shinto, the typical shrine consists of two buildings, an inner and an outer shrine. Anyone may visit the outer shrine, but the inner one is reserved strictly for priests and for government officials. Now, there is a reason for this. In the latter part of the 19th century, Japan was developing a serious form of nationalism, and state Shinto was established to engender patriotism and loyalty toward the nation of Japan. It became an instrument of support for the military in all the wars in which Japan participated in the latter part of the 19th century, as well as the first part of the 20th century, and it was particularly supportive of the Japanese war effort during World War II. Now, it is vital that you understand this, because Japan had a desire for empire building. As this state Shinto takes over, we have the Sino-Japanese War in 1894-1895. China is beaten. Then we have the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905. Russia is defeated in this one. In fact, an American president, Teddy Roosevelt, will actually help try to broker a peace deal for this. Then, in 1910, we have the annexation of Korea. And Japan seems to calm down a little bit. Now, they do not cooperate during the post-World War I era, when nations are beginning to shrink their military stockpiles. Japan signs a treaty and then quickly breaks it and continues to build itself up militarily. And so this will grow and grow until 1937, when China will be invaded by Japan once again. And let me say that this will be particularly brutal. This state Shinto, and quite honestly, the madness that it gave to the Japanese soldiers will cause them to be extremely cruel and extremely bitter as they bring horrific repercussions upon the Chinese people. In fact, historians talk about this event, and they actually talk about the rape of Nanking, because so many innocent individuals will just be slaughtered by Japanese soldiers. They will take advantage of everything they can possibly take advantage of. And so it is an extremely brutal situation. And of course, Japan being an island nation, they have limited resources. And they had to, in their own mind, expand into the Pacific to be able to get the resources they needed to be the industrial and, quite honestly, by that time, military power that they longed to be. And so this fanatical state Shinto will drive the cruelty of the Japanese soldiers. This is why they will basically not honor any kind of treaties for the treatment, ethical treatment at least, of prisoners of war, for example. Americans will have way more casualties in Japanese internment camps than they will in German internment camps, because the Japanese viewed American soldiers who had surrendered as being dishonorable people because they had done just that. They had surrendered. And so they were treated very cruelly. They were fed very sparsely. Many of them were worked, and the number of casualties will be tremendous. And all of this was a part of their religion. Well, this also helps explain why on some of the various islands, as the United States begins their island hopping in the Pacific War, that the Japanese soldiers would always try to fight to the death. Very few would surrender, and many, including women and children, if they were on the islands with their husbands, would commit suicide because that was considered more honorable than surrender or loss. And so, this fanatical attitude is going to play a tremendous role in probably the most grievous decision that an American president had to make. President Truman had to look at the situation. If we must invade mainland China, it is going to cost thousands of American lives, because literally he visioned that the United States would have to fight from one end of the island to the other, door to door. And that probably would have been close to fact. It would have also cost probably millions of Japanese lives. And so Truman made the decision to drop the nuclear bomb based on an interesting thought that in the ultimate, he would save lives, especially American, but that he would actually save Japanese lives as well. And so the order will be given. 2 nuclear bombs will be dropped. Thankfully, it didn't take a third one because we didn't have a third one. We only had the 2. And Japan will finally end the war and surrender. Now, as a result of World War II, state Shinto will move somewhat into the background. It will no longer actually be supported by the state. It will still be a patriotic type thing, but the fanaticalness of it will, of course, die out somewhat. Now, as we think of this, though this is not in your textbook, I think it's important that I point this out. Those who were a part of the Nazi Party, not all Germans, not all German soldiers for that matter, but those who were a part of the Nazi Party and those who were a part of what was called the SS, they had these same pseudo-religious fanatical attitudes that the Japanese did. And somehow in their warped and twisted minds, they believed that they were somehow serving God. In fact, early in the war, the German belt buckles actually had imprinted on them, "God with us." And yet, such a sinister, fanatical idea of Nazism. You are the superior people. You hate other people. You have the right to destroy other people. And so a point I made the other day, I want to make again in this lecture, that World War II was most assuredly a racist war. Japan viewing themselves as being the superior Asian race, the Germans viewing themselves as being the superior European race. And we can only imagine in our worst nightmares what the world might have been had either or both of these nations wound up winning their wars. But understand, both were the aggressors. Now, World War I was started by Austria, and Germany came in as the result of a treaty with Austria. World War II is started by Japan and by Germany, and both started with preemptive attacks on their enemies. And of course, the big preemptive attack will be the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese fleet in December 1941. And of course, that will be what will bring the United States into World War II. Luckily, and that's the only way I can put it, luckily, the two U.S. aircraft carriers that were supposed to be in Pearl Harbor were not there. They were delayed, and they actually sailed into Pearl Harbor on that Sunday afternoon. But many of our battleships were either severely damaged or destroyed. A lot of American lives were lost as a result of that. And the Japanese won a tremendous victory. It is interesting, though, their commander made what came to be a prophecy. As he is trying to calm the mood of celebration among his officers, he makes a simple statement. He says, "I'm afraid all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and filled him with resolve." And oh, how very true that statement was. It's exactly what took place. And of course, Hiroshima, Nagasaki are a part of that resolve. And so, sectarian Shinto will literally drive the Japanese nation into ruin after World War II. They will come back in a hurry because the Japanese tend to be very resilient people, but yet they were driven down as a result of the fanaticalness of this state religion that they had, as were, of course, the Nazis. So that is one branch of Shinto, the most dangerous branch, I might add. Secondly, we have what is called sectarian Shinto. This is the religious side of the beliefs. And of course, it was forced to identify itself separately and find its own support from the state form of the religion. Now let's understand, in this sectarian Shinto, a person could be in all conscience a Buddhist, a Confucian, and a member of his Shinto sect all at the same time, and see absolutely no problem with that. No contradictions, no difficulties whatsoever. And so, like many of our Indian religions, this sectarian Shinto tends to be very elastic in that it can expand and take in many, many different beliefs. Now, according to your textbook, there are 13 major sects of this Shinto that can be divided up into 3 main characteristics, and I'm really not interested that you have to learn these, just simply be aware of them. Now, the third form of Shinto, and this would actually be the one that was most regularly practiced by the Japanese people, would be domestic. And this is the form of Shinto that takes place within the Japanese home. There would usually be a corner in a room that would have symbols of whatever seemed to be of religious significance to the particular family. Now, this form would actually have no real nationalistic images. This would be what is important to the family. And this is probably something that would have been handed down from generation to generation to generation. And so, whatever the family considers a fit object for veneration, or whatever they consider to be their particular kami, is perfectly acceptable to them. And so this would be a form of religion where at times there would be offerings of flowers, of lanterns, of incense, of food, of drink, and these may take place daily or they may take place at specified intervals, just depending upon the particular family. Now, many times in this domestic Shinto, the kami would probably be some kind of very respected and honored ancestor. And so it would take on that do not shame the family, do not shame the ancestors attitude that is so prevalent throughout all the Far East. And so that would be a very, very important form of this. Again, that family may be a Buddhist and they may be a Confucian as they practice this domestic form of Shinto. And they would see absolutely no contradictions with it. Okay, as we look at Japanese festivals, and they are quite interesting, they usually are a combination of secular, agricultural, Buddhist, and Shinto all thrown together. And to the Japanese, the most important month is October, because that is the month of the kami, of the various gods and goddesses. Now, the most widely celebrated holiday in Japan, as is in lots of parts of the world, is New Year. Businesses close, people gather with their families, there are dinners, celebrations, you can be cleansed of various passions, and that would kind of be like our having New Year's resolutions and so on. So New Year's will always have a very, very huge significance, not only to the Japanese, but to all people in the Far East. Buddha's birthday is celebrated in April. And, you know, a lot of people will celebrate Buddha's birthday even if they don't profess to be Buddhists. I guess sorta, as we would say, like some people in this country would celebrate Christmas even if they were not Christians. Now, the Buddhists in Japan will celebrate an All Souls Day in July. Europe's All Souls Day, by the way, is October 31st. And so this is a celebration. And then in autumn, we have a agricultural festival that is basically a combination of agriculture and Shinto, and it is somewhere in November to sometimes backing up into October, but usually November. Now, as we look at Shinto today, the United States, one of the things that was emphasized in the peace treaty was that Shinto would no longer be a state-supported religion. And if you go to Japan today, probably the majority of Japanese would consider themselves Buddhist. And Shinto would be a secondary practice to them, kind of a backup type of religion. Shinto has not faded. It is still quite strong in Japan. Now you have new sects that have come along. Some of those emphasize faith healing, positive thinking, chanting. And so Shinto is still evolving. It's still fluid. It is still very much a part of Japanese life and Japanese culture. Excuse me. So this gets us through our three major Asian religions. And we will prepare a test regarding these three religions. It'll be a discussion test, and it'll be one where you can use both your textbook and your notes in the taking of that text. Okay, so let's go to our last session, and this will be where we look at the religions that come out of the Middle East. And these are going to be religions that are very, very impactful upon us as Americans today. Now, I want to mention one. The older textbooks brought this religion out. The newer textbooks have chosen to omit it, but it was called Zoroastrianism. It became the religion of the Persian Empire, beginning with Cyrus, who, of course, is often known as Cyrus the Great. And it is going to be a religion that will affect, in some ways, both Judaism, but especially Islam. It is an earthy type of religion. It basically worships the elements of earth and so on, and has some very strange practices and beliefs. But there are ideas that it will borrow from Judaism that will cause the authors of the old textbook, before it was edited, to believe that Zoroastrianism actually influenced Judaism. Now, I would dispute that. I would differ with that 100%. Any influences that were made on the part of Judaism to Zoroastrianism, because Judaism is the much older, way more developed religion. So as we begin with Judaism, let me make a couple of interesting statements. The nation of Israel, even in its glorious past under David and Solomon, whom we will talk about, was never that big a territory. It was a small kingdom in a small part of the world, and yet the impact it has had on world history is staggering. Literally, never has such a small region had such a tremendous impact on all of world history. Now, Israel was located in the middle of some of those very important trade routes, especially routes coming from the east and the west and going down into Egypt. And so it was in a very important position and a place where it could provide quite a bit of influence. But let's ask the question, the textbook kind of deals with. If we were to define Judaism, we might have a problem with that. For some people, Jews would be people who adhere to a certain group of religious beliefs and practices, while others may define Judaism as being a race of people. And quite honestly, both of these factors would be true. It might surprise you to know that there are more than likely more faithful practicing Jews in New York City than there are in the modern state of Israel. Just one of those phenomenons of history. A lot of the people living in Israel today are not living there because they embrace biblical Judaism, but because they are Jews racially. So question, what is a Jew? Well, it's not just a nation. A Jew is not just a race. A Jew is not just a religion. But may we say that Judaism is a people tied by a common history, some basic common beliefs, and some common observances. Judaism can go from orthodox to liberal, and everywhere in between, orthodox trying as best they can to adhere to biblical Judaism, the liberal groups not so much trying to. Now, Judaism will very conveniently be defined by race by Adolf Hitler. You know, that is the way he is going to identify the Jewish people. And of course, he's going to do so to use them as a scapegoat to bring about some of his diabolical ideas and plans during World War II. And of course, millions of Jews will suffer tremendously as a result of that madman. But let's realize, not only did Jews suffer, but all of Europe suffered as a result of Hitler. Those 6 million Jews will die in the concentration and death camps. You will have 7 million others that will also die in those various camps. So, you know, calling Hitler a madman is probably a grievous understatement of what that individual truly was. So, as you think about Judaism, may I say that it is basically impossible to separate the history of the people from their religion. And, of course, their history is very much going to affect their theological thinking and practice. The general unifying feature among all Jews is going to be the belief in the oneness of a God who works in and through historical events, and who has in some manner chosen the Jewish people to be his agents upon the earth. Okay, that in mind, let me say a few things about the Hebrew Scriptures. Number one, I personally believe the Hebrew Scriptures to be inspired. In other words, God himself guided the writers of the Hebrew Scriptures. I believe the same thing about the New Testament Scriptures as well. Now, though the Bible does not purport to be a scientific book, though it is not strictly a historical book, any time the Bible makes reference to scientific facts, it is accurate. Anytime it makes reference to historical peoples in the light of developing the history of the nation of Israel, those historical facts are true. Many of the pagan kings that are listed in the books of the Hebrew Bible actually lived, actually ruled, actually did historically what the Hebrew Scriptures credit them with. And so the Hebrew Scriptures are adequate. Now, just a thought. Though the Hebrew Bible does not purport to be a science book, it is quite interesting that the 5 laws of physics are brought out in the very first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, in the beginning, time, God, force, created, action, the heavens, space, the earth, matter. 5 laws of physics. Right there in the very, very first verse of the Bible. I find that remarkable. So, do I believe that Genesis chapter 1 records creation as it happened and in 6 days? And my answer is yes, unequivocally. I believe that in part because of the very use of the Hebrew word yom. That is their word for day. Any time throughout Hebrew history when the word yom is used in connection with a time, it always refers to a 24-hour day. Well, every one of the days of creation in Genesis 1, it makes mention of the evening and morning, day 1, day 2, day 3, so on. So there is your mention of a time element with the word yom. Now, people say, why evening? Well, the Jews are on a lunar calendar. And so to them, a day begins in the evening, not at midnight. That is from the Roman calendar. And so that is why the book of Genesis records it as it does. Also, in Exodus chapter 20, as Moses is being given the 10 Commandments there, God clearly states to them that he created the world in 6 yom days. And so these statements cause me to believe that the Bible is accurate in what it tells us. Now, does it go into the detail we might want it to go into? No, but that's okay. God gives us enough information, and he gave the Jewish people enough information that they knew who it was. And so, as we think about the book of Genesis, It is a most fascinating book of the Bible. Of course, we have the origins of the earth. And then we have a passage of time, probably roughly about 1,600 years. And people have become extremely wicked. And as a result of that, God decides to punish the world. But he doesn't want to destroy everyone. So God selects a family. They build this giant, what is called ark. The word ark in the Hebrew actually means chest, but a big floating barge, if you will. And God puts that family and samples of animals from the earth and sends a great flood and brings that family through. Well, in Genesis chapter 10, we have how Noah's 3 sons, who their descendants were. And Genesis chapter 10 is actually kind of the early roll of nations on earth. And in that early roll of nations on earth, we see where the various peoples came from. So Genesis 10 might be considered, if you are a historian, the beginning of the historical period. Well, some years after this, God again selects a family. This time in the name of an individual originally known as Abram. His name will later be changed to Abraham. And God makes some wonderful promises to him. Number one, he would become the father of a great nation. In fact, it will be pointed out several times in the Old Testament scriptures that Abraham's descendants were like the stars of the heaven and the sands of the seashore. And so, in that respect, he became the father of a great nation. Number two, that one day his descendants would possess a very special, chosen, wonderful land. Now, if you've ever been to Israel, you probably can't imagine what it must have been like when the Jews initially settled there, because wars and other things have ravaged the country tremendously. But at one time, it must have been a most special place on earth. But then number three, and this not only is a blessing for what, shall we say, are the Jewish people, but a blessing for all people on earth. And that's exactly what God promised him, that he would become a blessing for all people. And as we will note in our study of Judaism and of Christianity, Jesus Christ will be a physical descendant of Abraham. And so every Christian is a recipient of that blessing that would come through that descendant of Abraham. Now, Abraham's a special guy. When we're introduced to him, he lives in a place called Ur of Chaldees, probably one of the most modern cities on earth in that day and time. And God appears to him and basically says, Abraham, I want you to move. I want you to leave your family and go to a place that I'm going to show you, and really doesn't tell him where he's going. But Abraham has such faith in God that he trusts him completely. Now, I have to say something about Sarah here. Sarah is Abraham's wife. She had to be a very remarkable woman in and of herself. If I can assure you, if I walked into my wife this afternoon and said, we're going to move, and she said, where? And I said, I don't know, just wherever we're led. I can assure you not one dish is going to be packed, Not one spoon's going to be wrapped. We're going nowhere until she knows where and why. I understand that. But Sarah, with her explicit faith, first in God, and then, of course, a trust in her husband, she will follow him. And so Abraham will have a son. His name will be Isaac. Isaac will have two sons, and actually 2 races of people will somewhat come from Isaac's 2 sons. And his younger son will actually outdo the older brother, which was very unusual in that time, but Jacob, supplanter, did so. And he, in turn, will have 12 sons. And his 12 sons will become the basis of what will be the tribes of Israel. Now, Jacob's sons kind of had a sordid history. They had a younger brother named Joseph, and Jacob fancied Joseph, and it was very obvious that he did. And just a little point of child rearing for your thought later on in your lives. Don't favor one child above another. It always causes problems. Well, these brothers really didn't like Joseph, and given an opportunity, they actually sold him into slavery and then feigned his death before their father. And Joseph was sold and went down into Egypt and was sold to a captain of Pharaoh's guard, an individual named Potiphar. Now, it is believed historically that Joseph went into Egypt at the time of the second intermediary period when the Hyksos, the shepherd kings, were ruling. This might explain some of the things that will happen in Joseph's life. Well, Joseph goes down there and he proves himself to be very, very capable, becomes the lead servant in Potiphar's household. And because he's a young man, Potiphar's wife kind of gets, may I say, a little frisky toward him. And as a result of his honor, he said he could not commit such great sin before God. He is thrown in prison. Now, I want you to think of something. Potiphar's wife is sure not going to tell people she had an affair with a servant. And, of course, Joseph would have been smart enough not to admit that, I'm sure. As far as people were concerned, he could have probably gotten away with the sin. But he knew God was watching. He knew God was in control. And so even under tremendous pressure, he is able to maintain his integrity and be the kind of individual that God himself would have expected him to be. Well, Joseph gets thrown in prison, and he will wind up interpreting 2 dreams of servants of Pharaoh. Both the dreams come to pass just exactly like Joseph interpreted them. One of the men will be executed, the other will be restored to his position. And the one that was going to be restored, Joseph reminded him, "You remember me to Pharaoh." Well, he conveniently forgot Joseph for a while. And then Pharaoh had some dreams. And whoa, were these weird dreams. 7 healthy cows come out of the Nile River, which the Egyptians worship. Then 7 thin cows come out of the Nile River and eat the healthy cows and gain no weight. And then there are 7 grains of some kind of grain product that are very, very healthy. 7 unhealthy grains come and eat them, and the dreams are over. And of course, Pharaoh, none of his magicians, none of his people in the land, none of them have a clue. And so they're at their wits' end as to what these dreams might mean. And finally, the butler remembers, oh, I forgot this guy in the prison that can interpret dreams. So they clean Joseph up, bring him to the Pharaoh, and Joseph points out real quick, and I think this is important, about Joseph's character. He doesn't take credit for interpreting dreams. He gives credit to God. Now, let's realize the Egyptians and the Hyksos would have been polytheistic people, but Joseph believes in the one true and living God. And so he's going to be very, very loyal to him. So, as we think about this then, Joseph interprets the dreams. He says there's going to be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. Famines were quite often in the Middle East, so that wouldn't be something totally unreasonable and out of line. But Joseph's smart enough to say, now, what Pharaoh really needs to do is appoint a wise person to collect foodstuffs during the 7 good years, so we're able to provide for the people during the 7 bad years. And Pharaoh likes the idea. And he decides, who's smarter than this guy Joseph? So he makes him number 2 person in all of the land of Egypt. Now, a couple of thoughts here. This is one reason I really believe that it was during that second intermediate period. Because I do not believe a native Egyptian Pharaoh, and by the way, the word Pharaoh simply means great house. I don't think a native Pharaoh would have appointed a foreigner number 2 person in his land. But the Hyksos, being foreign people, wouldn't make any big difference. So Joseph went to work on his project, and everything goes well. They make preparations, they accomplish what they want to accomplish, and they're as prepared as any people can be prepared for the upcoming plague. Okay, back up just a bit, and then we'll come back and pick up our story. How were these guys living? How did Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob live? Basically, they are nomads. They are wandering around from place to place, following their flocks, so they're herds people. They worship God, whom they believe to guide their destinies, in open altars as they move around from place to place. In fact, you can actually trace Abraham's life and where he settled by the various places where he built altars. And so they worship God in the open, looking and waiting for his promises. Well, back to Joseph. Everything's ready. Well, the famine hits up in Canaan as well. And so Jacob sends the majority of his sons down to Egypt to buy some grain. Joseph, who's in charge of this, recognizes them. They don't recognize Joseph. Now, he probably was a teenager when he was sent down there. They weren't expecting to see him alive. They figured he was long dead. And of course, some of them probably had not changed all that much since he had last seen them. So he's kind of rough on them. Starts, it appears, to take a little vengeance on his brothers. 10 will come down. Joseph has a younger brother that was born later. He will actually keep one in prison as a surety. And so he sends the brothers back. They hope they never have to go back again, but they run out of food and they go back to Joseph. And he told them the only way he would ever see them again is for them to bring his younger brother. Now, there are implications in the scripture that he wanted to keep Benjamin, the younger brother, of course, the one that had absolutely nothing to do with what took place in his life, keep him with him and send the other brothers back. But Joseph has a change of heart. He reveals himself to his brothers, which is a total shock to them. And the greater shock is Joseph is not going to take vengeance upon his brothers. Now, that was a common practice in that day and time. If someone wronged you, you got even with them. Every way you possibly could. If they hurt you, you were going to try to hurt them more. That's just life as it was in the Old Testament biblical times. But Joseph chooses forgiveness. Now, what he will ultimately do is move all of his family down to Egypt so he can provide for them more fully. And so about 70 people are going to wind up moving into Egypt, and there the curtain goes down on the book of Genesis. Well, as the curtain opens with the book of Exodus, some major changes have taken place. Exodus says, there arose a king in Egypt who did not know Joseph. That's the Bible's way of saying the Hyksos have gone. They've been expelled from the country. And in their place, native Egyptian rulers are there. Well, let's think about something. If you came in to a nation under the leadership of a people that had conquered that nation, when that people were driven out, you would still be viewed as foreigners and tied to those people. And so you're not going to be loved, appreciated, wanted, or trusted. And that's exactly what happens to the Jewish people. The Egyptians decide to take advantage of them, and they enslave them. Now, to blow a popular myth, the Jews did not build the pyramids. The pyramids were in Egypt long before that time. They were there long before Abraham ever went into Canaan, and he did make one short visit to Egypt himself. But the pyramids had been there a long time. They basically build storage and treasure cities for the Egyptians. And when the Egyptians come back into this New Kingdom period, as it is called, they are a very, very strong people indeed. And so you've got the Israelites enslaved, but they're still growing. They're having children. Their children are growing up, and the Egyptians get fearful. And finally, since the Egyptians feel they can't work the Jews to death, they will actually order the murder of some of their babies. And there's one Jewish mother that decides she's going to see that her little baby is spared. And so she builds a little mini ark, if you will, and puts the baby afloat in the Nile River. And as it turns out, one of the princesses of Egypt finds this baby and takes this baby in as her own. And he's given the name Moshek. By the way, that is not a Hebrew name. It is an Egyptian name. It means drawn out. Well, a very fitting name. I got this baby out of the river, so he's drawn out of the river. And so this young man, who is actually a Jew, is going to be raised in the royal court of Egypt for the first 40 years of his life. So he would be educated, he would live in luxury and wealth, he would have it made. But, interestingly enough, the Bible tells us that his older sister kind of followed the basket down, and when the princess found him, the older sister asked if she needed a nurse, in other words, someone to take care of the baby for her, and she agreed. So Moses' own mother raised him. So you know he knew who he was, what he was, and so on. Well, after about 40 years, Moses will one day be out and he's viewing what is taking place to the Jewish people, and he finds it so cruel, and eventually he winds up killing one of the Egyptian taskmasters. And he has to flee from Egypt as a result of this. So he leaves this home he's known for the first 40 years of his life, goes across a desert, and winds up in a place called Midian. Well, for the next 40 years of his life, Moses will live there, and he will be a shepherd. He will raise flocks. So let's look at some things here. First 40 years of his life, educated, probably knew mathematics, could read and write, very, very advanced young man. Then, the next 40 years of his life, he becomes a herdsman. And of course, that can help train you on dealing with people and having public relations. And that's something that Moses was going to need. So, at the end of that second 40 years, a unique experience happens to Moses. While he's on the mountain, he sees a bush that is burning, but does not burn up. And naturally, he's curious, so he approaches it. And as he does, a voice comes out of that bush. Number one, the voice tells him that he's to take off his sandals because he's on holy ground. And Moses asks who this is. And the voice tells him that I am who I am. And later, the name Yahweh will be given to Moses. The one who is. And this is the divine name of the God of the Bible, Yahweh. The one who is. Now, the Bible will have a lot to say about idolatry. I'm going to quickly paraphrase a couple of verses, but basically the Bible will say idols have eyes but they can't see, ears they can't hear, a mouth but they can't speak, hands they can't do anything, feet they can't walk. And usually they're made out of a tree, and part of the tree will be taken and burned as a fire, and they'll decorate it with gold and silver, and they'll fall down and worship these things. And so, as God reveals himself to Moses here, he wants to make it very clear, I am not what the Egyptians worship. I am not like what the Egyptians worship. I am a living being. I am the one who is. And when Moses gets all that information processed, God tells him exactly why he's appeared to him. I'm going to send you back down to Egypt, and you're going to deliver my people. You're going to bring them to a new land, and they're going to worship me there. And you can imagine, Moses had already fled Egypt once, and so he's not the most excited person in the world about this commission from God. And he's somewhat reluctant. He offers several excuses to God as to why he can't do this. But eventually he is convinced. And Moses will, in obedience with what God wants him to do, pick up and return to the land of Egypt. And so this is the beginning of what we call the book of Exodus. Now we'll go ahead and break here. And when we come back on Thursday, we will talk about Moses going back, what takes place, and some of the very significant events that come out of that, and then how the Jews will ultimately go to the land of Canaan. They'll establish themselves there as a people and establish a worship to Yahweh, ultimately culminating in the building of a great temple in the city of Jerusalem. Okay, we'll stop here. Hope you have a really good day, and please, guys, be safe.